Hello, my name is Lucy Miree. I'm an English grad student at the University of North Florida, and my pronouns are she, her. Today, I will be discussing my paper titled, I Want More Life, Learning from the AIDS Epidemic and Finding Meaning in the Age of COVID-19 with Angels in America. So, just a quick disclaimer before we start. I did write this paper at the end of April, and so a lot of the things I referenced to about COVID and where we're at in the pandemic might seem a little bit outdated. This is why, and I'm going to address those as I go. Rather than trying to unravel the complete point, I thought it would be better to present the paper in totality as written and then just address that where necessary. Okay, let's get started. The coronavirus pandemic currently plaguing our world has put us in a state of continual emergency. Writings on the subject have largely been in the vector of news bulletins and infographics. We are not really interested in the conceptual nature of COVID-19 because as death toll grows, there seems to be less and less room to grapple with what it means that this virus has been handled so poorly, or that the government seems ready to sacrifice its citizens on the altar of economic recovery. It might seem that as the death toll rises, making any art about what we're experiencing is either callous or impossible. A version of Adorno's oft-cited, to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. Yet it also seems that without some sort of meaningful touchstone of expression, we are in a never-ending freefall. What fiction or imaginative work that has been made about the pandemic has been largely pulpy and kind of insubstantial. Lockdown-based romances, quirky comedies entirely on Zoom, etc. This is not feeding us, and this is not consoling us. When we search for meaning in the age of COVID, where can we turn? How can we interpret the many grim lessons we've learned over the course of this national failure, and how can we get our hope back? I argue that America can gain this perspective by looking backward to another terrible pandemic, the AIDS crisis. Understanding the AIDS epidemic as the true precursor to our current national crisis opens us up to learning from the wealth of fictional and non-fictional works made about AIDS. One of the most generative is inarguably Tony Kushner's Angels in America, a gay fantasia on national themes. I do have the playbook with me, and I will say that if you're not familiar with it, I really recommend reading it, or even better, watching a version of the play. It is a really wonderful play, and you'll find it especially relevant to these times, and I hope you'll find it somewhat soul-restoring as I did when I revisited this for my paper. So, in this paper, I will explore how, by comparing AIDS to the coronavirus pandemic, Angels in America's complex characters become mirrors for the world around us now, and can show a battered, emotionally exhausted nation how to heal the psychological wounds of COVID, with an ultimate message of understanding, community, and forgiveness. By comparing these two disasters and holding up one of the most complete imaginative works on the subject of one, I can use the hard-learned lessons of our history to forge a way forward in the other. AIDS has a lot to teach us about COVID, and it's time that we listen. Though the primary focus of this paper is based on close reading Angels in America and relating it back to our current time, perhaps it's necessary to first justify the link between AIDS and coronavirus and to explore what bearing AIDS history has on the pandemic. Many would look to the Spanish influenza outbreak in 1918 as the most comparable to COVID, but I would argue that, by virtue of being closer to the present, the AIDS epidemic is more useful for understanding the culture around COVID, especially sociopolitically. Ronald Reagan looms large over every other scene in Angels in America, just as Donald Trump's visage will mar this era of history forever, even now that he's left office. And like COVID, this deadly disease was made a political issue in a hostile, reactionary conservative political environment. Ronald Reagan did not publicly speak about AIDS until September 1985, despite the fact that there had been, in the years previous, over 3,600 deaths. We see this lack of care made drastically overt from Trump, who complained at one point, quote, "That's all I hear about now, that's all I hear, turn on the television, COVID, 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 COVID," in October 2020. I'm sure we all remember that really irritating quote. Another similarity to be remarked upon between the coronavirus and AIDS is how America responded to its origins and its primary sufferers. Both COVID and AIDS originated from a racial and geographical other. Coronavirus became publicized after the Wuhan, China outbreak, while AIDS is understood to have originated in Kinshasa and Democratic Republic of the Congo. As well, the most publicized carriers of AIDS were gay men, marking it again as the disease of the other. This paved the way for, according to Parker, quote, an an initial tendency towards denial on the part of governments and broader society about the threats posed by the epidemic, end quote. An unfortunately common discussion early in the COVID crisis was that it would mostly affect the elderly, as if this somehow made it less of a pressing concern. As we have seen, COVID also has more of an effect on poor communities, often communities comprised and primarily of people of color. Sorry, there's a cat in the room. We'll just keep going, though. What AIDS had that COVID unfortunately has not, however, is a legacy of powerful worldwide protest and activism. Parker writes, quote, "From the very early years of the pandemic to roughly the early to mid-1990s, an initial phase of relatively intense activist mobilization took place to combat severe social stigma, denial, and inaction on the part of the government and public health officials," end quote. These organizations, such as ACT UP, began as extremely grassroots movements, and they relied on intense public pressure and uncomfortable, unavoidable visibility for a disease in a population that no one wanted to see. These movements were extremely provocative and extremely effective. Quote, "It is impossible to overstate just how important grassroots pressure was," end quote. Though in the summer of 2020, we did see powerful Black Lives Matter protests that were certainly intensified for the pressure of the pandemic in the background, and though some mutual aid organizations, etc., have stepped up to serve their communities, there has not been, at least at point of writing and recording, a widespread, forceful COVID protest movement. There are some possible reasons for this, such as the logistical difficulty of organizing while socially distant, or the existence of social media as the primary outlet for social engagement for many people, but it is disappointing nonetheless. And commenting on this does not in any way mean to talk down on what organizers did during the pandemic. It's just to note that this is a difference that is sorely felt. Even when, at time of writing, the light at the end of the tunnel seems close at hand with COVID, considering the current rollout of vaccines, there is still a lot to learn and appreciate from AIDS activism. This is one of the places where I would like to jump in and say that now, in late July, it seems like it's a little more complicated than just rolling out the vaccines and everything's done, but I do think the point still stands. So, back to AIDS activism. Its tactics were both transformative and historically based. AIDS activism can be seen as the connection point between the liberation movements of the 60s and 70s to social justice activism today. Many of its organizers' tactics were borrowed from the civil rights movement and women's lib, but it also popularized new methods such as the die-in, which I'm sure you've probably heard of before, and which has become increasingly popular with contemporary protest movements. AIDS activists understood optics and mobilization and how to build coalitions of diverse grassroots movements, and Parker notes that, quote, "they quickly came to serve as models for other similar organizations," end quote. We can also understand AIDS as the starting point for contemporary healthcare equity movements. As funding for research and treatment stagnated, quote, "a growing transnational activist movement took shape around issues of treatment access and health equity," end quote. Issues of access to medication, equal quality of care, and expeditious rollout of new research and trials were the front and center of AIDS activism. And it's easy to see how this links with the current push for universal health care, for example. I do believe that without the AIDS epidemic and the activism therein, we would not be at the point now where we're having such a national discussion of something like universal health care. With the similarity and relevancy thus established to my satisfaction, the question becomes, why Angels in America? It is true that the play was something of an instant classic, canonized rapidly by press and critics after its premiere. Still, I do agree there are a number of other powerful pieces of media created about the AIDS epidemic, including works that deal more specifically with activism and medical treatment of disease, such as Larry Kramer's The Normal Heart or Randy Schultz's And the Band Played On. What Tony Kushner offers in Angels in America, though, is something I consider a different lens on the issue. Rather than the, of course, entirely justified and correct outrage and urgent grief of other AIDS-based works, this play assumes the grueling task of making meaning out of the tragedy and trying to find hope within it. Kushner is looking for a future, and Angels in America is operatic, searching, contemplative, and vast. Kushner engages with the multifaceted agonies and outrages of a plague made worse by government neglect on metaphorical, emotional, and not to sound hokey, but even spiritual levels, digging underneath the material realities of the AIDS crisis to get at the damage done to the American psychological condition. And I do think that this is just as important. This is what we need now for this pandemic as much as it was needed then. I am primarily engaging with this text through analysis of Kushner's complex, deeply realized characters. It seems fitting, then, to begin with the most obvious, Roy Cohn. A real McCarthy-era lawyer, this is not the first work of gay theater to use his likeness, and, quote, he has been posthumously seized on as epitomizing, and so perhaps illuminating certain contradictions in America's current political and cultural climate, end quote. In the Trump era, Roy Cohn seems more relevant than ever as one of Trump's major influences and mentors. Indeed, we see familiarity in Kushner's version of Roy. Roy is not religious, not at all interested in the family values side of conservatism, and yet he still apes that moralistic bend as best as he can to endear Joe Pitt, a Mormon, to his side. He says, "I respect principles. I'm not religious, but I like God and God likes me." This is, of course, reminiscent of Donald Trump's showboating in front of a D.C. church with a Bible for a photo op, despite being very obviously secular or perhaps even atheist, and also apparently having no idea how to hold a Bible, which was definitely interesting. Men like Cohn and Trump don't care about any system of beliefs but that of power, or in Trump's case, perhaps money, how to get it, and how to keep it. Roy is at his most worshipful when he proclaims, "This is gastric juices turning. This stinks. This is politics, Joe. The game of being alive." We also see Roy engage in a sort of doublespeak that is Trump's signature, but which can be heard from conservative politicians at large. The notion of fake news places the very idea of what is true and what is false in question. News was something we previously understood, at least ostensibly, to be true. If nothing else, we deluded ourselves into believing that this was true in America. Similarly, Roy Cohn reinvents political realities in Angels in America. He explicitly divines his own homosexuality away, telling his doctor, "AIDS is what homosexuals have. I have liver cancer." His denial is not, or at least not exclusively, based in personal shame. Instead, he is looking at the social stratification of the world and throwing his lot in with what he considers to be the winning team. And though the real Roy Cohn's sticky, complicated relationship with his own gayness, quote, reflects in microcosm the much broader question of America's identity crisis, end quote, I am not interested in exploring that homosexuality in this paper. It is not what exactly he lies about and uses his power for, but the fact that he lies and misuses his power that makes him an apt character to hold up as a comparison during COVID. In Roy Cohn, I see politicians who denied the truth of COVID, who actively contributed to the conditions that caused hundreds of thousands to die, but who still cashed in their power to protect themselves from the disease. Roy Cohn uses his power to gain access to a stash of AZT, thereby depriving other people suffering with AIDS who signed up for the experimental drug trial to get it. After contributing to a conservative socio-political climate, one that actively made things worse for gay men, and which definitely influenced the slow response to the mounting crisis, Roy Cohn is able to get the best treatment for himself. Many politicians today did the same thing, spreading anti-mask sentiments and conspiracy theories, then having access to the best care if they got sick, and being some of the very first to receive the vaccine. Though Roy, despite his best efforts, paid the price for the world that he built, many of the Republicans who got COVID, including Trump, were protected and survived and didn't really ever suffer any consequences. If Roy represents our politicians, then the young clerk he mentors, Joe Pitt, represent the constituents who bought the lie. According to Stephen Bottoms, quote, Joe and his family thus typify middle American values in being family-oriented, well-meaning and idealistic, and at the same time fundamentally conservative, displaying a painful ignorance of the other, end quote. Joe believes in the American dream, and he trusts a scumbag like Roy Cohn to bring that to him. Though fundamentally gentle and sweet by nature, repeatedly he talks about his desire to be strong, to be selfish, and to be clean, and he inherently also has this sort of barely under the surface simmering anger and violence. In the character of Joe, quote, Angels mounts an attack against ideologies of individualism while also problematizing the idea of community, end quote. In other words, the rhetoric of individualism is aspirational to Joe as a conservative, but it is also his commitment to conservative groupthink and his desire to live in two communities at once that is his ultimate downfall. Like Roy, Joe is a Republican trying to hide the fact that he's gay. Unlike Roy, who freely has sex with men and simply lies and threatens enough for it not to be publicly discussed, Joe suffers in silence with intense feelings of shame, while also doing a pretty poor job of hiding what he actually wants. One of the other main characters in the play, Louis Ironson, recognizes a fellow gay man immediately, saying, well, oh boy, a gay Republican, in their first meeting. Roy seems at least peripherally aware from the start as well, though it's not made text until much later, and he calls Joe a sissy at one point. It's made brutally clear to the audience, though, how much pain it causes Joe to conceal this part of himself, and early on he says, quote, I have fought with everything I have to kill it. For God's sake, there's nothing left. I'm a shell. There's nothing left to kill. When he starts a relationship with Louis, he vacillates between euphoria and fear, and at one point proclaims to Louis, I'm flayed, no past now, I could give up anything. Ultimately, his desire to have it both ways, that is, to live out his gayness while continuing to be a part of the Republican political machine, is ultimately what drives Louis away. When Louis discovers cases Joe's signed off on, including one that ruled homosexuals don't have equal protections under the law, he is horrified that Joe would transgress against his own community in such a way. Many conservative voters and many COVID deniers are poor, working class, and often live in the southern U.S. They frequently vote against what would presumably be in their interest. In this way, they sort of go against class solidarity. And as a result, they put their lives on the line for conservative pundits who told them COVID was a hoax, and some of them died for it. Like Joe, they put their belief in something that caused them great pain. For every Roy Cohn, there are at least a dozen Joe Pitts. Kushner crafts Joe's story in such a way that demands sympathy from the audience, and Kushner seems to be asking something very difficult of that audience, which one imagines is largely liberal. Make room for the Joe Pitts in your world. Healing the wounds left behind by this ordeal involves the people who are misled as well. At some point, reconciliation has to begin, and that starts with feeling the pain and loss they have experienced after being mistreated by the violent ideology that they thought would make them good and clean. This idea of empathy and kindness is further carried in the character of Belize. Belize is the best friend of the main character, Prior Walter, and is a black ex-drag queen and nurse. More specifically, he has the misfortune of being Roy Cohn's nurse. He cares deeply for Prior and reminds the overly theoretical Louis of the real-world implications of his thoughts and actions. In one memorable scene, he says, Well, I hate America, Louis. I hate this country. It's just big ideas and stories and people dying and people like you. The white cracker who wrote the national anthem knew what he was doing. He set the word free to a note so high nobody else can reach it. You come with me to room 1013 over at the hospital and I'll show you America. Terminal, crazy, and mean. In this way, in a play that is much concerned with the fantastical, Belize keeps the audience grounded. As the sole character of color, he is a reminder of the social stratification evident in every level of American society, but made all the more clear by the AIDS crisis. In his interactions with Roy, he is similarly acerbic, but also remains true to his profession, caring for someone he finds utterly detestable. This didn't come from me and I don't like you, Belize says, before giving Roy Cohn valuable medical advice that might prolong his life. Kushner allows Belize to heft a lot of the weight of the theme of forgiveness in this play. He proclaims it outright, saying, quote, All today it's felt like Thanksgiving. Soon this ruination will be blanketed white. You can smell it. Softness, compliance, forgiveness, and grace. By the final act of Perestroika, the second of the two-play behemoth that comprises Angels in America as a whole, Belize has become the moral center of the play. He recruits Louis to steal Roy's remaining AZT stash after the man's death, but also asks Louis to pray the Kaddish over Roy's body. When Louis is understandably indignant at the notion of blessing someone so nasty, Belize speaks this benediction that seems to be Kushner speaking directly to the audience. He was a terrible person. He died a hard death. So maybe a queen can forgive her vanquished foe. It isn't easy. It doesn't count if it's easy. It's the hardest thing, forgiveness, which is maybe where love and justice finally meet. If Belize can forgive Roy Cohn, Kushner is asking, what's your excuse? Roy Cohn pays the ultimate price for the evil he did. He dies sad and alone. But receiving consequences does not, for Kushner, mean no absolution. In fact, the act of forgiveness seems to be more for the living than for the dead. Belize is thanking Roy after stealing the AZT he'll be able to give to Pryor, and perhaps soothing his own moral wavering on the theft itself. Especially given Belize's role as a nurse, a group of people who have toiled and suffered far too much during COVID, this is a powerful message today. And I don't mean by this that we should just let everyone get off scot-free and forgive Donald Trump and all of the politicians and pretend it never happened, not forgiving and forgetting. First of all, they haven't suffered the consequences that they should suffer like Roy, but also I think that the point that Kushner is making is that we need to be able to make peace with what's happened in order to start building forward. That doesn't mean we forget. We still can summon up that anger, but it will eat away at us, and there is something powerful about being able to claim that forgiveness when it feels right, like Belize does with Roy Cohn. It's one of the most moving parts of the play to me. So, I have managed to get quite far in this paper without talking about the most prominent character and the most central point of Angels in America, which is Pryor Walter and his struggle with the angel's prophecy. So, Pryor contracts AIDS, and then his lover Lewis leaves him. It's quite a Job-like setup for his central conflict. He has been chosen by the angels of heaven as the new prophet to deliver this message to humanity. You must stop moving. The angel who visits Pryor intends for his death to deliver a message. The forward movement of humanity, the change and energy and progress must cease, quote, in the hope that immobility will once again prompt the return of God and the forward movement of time, end quote. God has abandoned the angels and heaven is cracking, and the angels believe that humans are at fault, and the problem must be corrected before the new millennium begins. The angel proclaims, on you, in your blood we have written stasis, the end. Her demand is a terrifying one, but one that seems impossible to ignore. There's a sort of dual symbology to her character, and Savrin notes that, quote, Kushner's angel and her/his heaven serve as a constant reminder of both the catastrophe of AIDS, that is, AIDS, racism, and homophobia, and of the perpetual possibility of millennium's approach, end quote. She is the herald trying to preserve the future, but her methods of doing so seem cruel or fearsome, or even far-fetched in their possible efficacy. It's probably readily apparent how this maps directly onto the coronavirus pandemic response. In fact, it does so in two slightly juxtaposing ways. First, the government had us go into lockdown, and many, though notably not all, as many refused to acknowledge the severity of the problem, did comply. Literally, we stopped moving. However, Americans were not adequately provided for to do this sustainably. Many could not afford to stay at home, and many lost their jobs or had their businesses close. Like Pryor, we were ill-prepared for the task given to us. To illustrate this, Pryor describes the experience of one of his ancestors on a capsizing boat being thrown overboard to compensate for the weight. Quote, people in a boat, waiting, terrified, while implacable, unsmiling men, irresistibly strong, sees maybe the person next to you, maybe you, with no warning at all. This feeling, like being picked out and tossed into the sea without a way of floating, is how Pryor feels after his AIDS diagnosis, and also reflects people coping with the way COVID impacted their lives. We were not equipped. We were not prepared. We were just given this impossible task to try to fix the problem basically by ourselves. Then, of course, there is what the angel is actually asking of Pryor, to sacrifice himself, to die. We saw this from our government officials after the initial lockdown. When the economy started to suffer, Americans were urged to get back to work despite the obvious danger. Politicians are aware that this means some people dying, and even admitted they thought this necessary in some cases. We are expected, like Pryor, to be martyrs to return the economy and the country to stasis. Human life must be lost to keep the wheel of industry turning. Sorry that grandma has to die, but we need to get the Dow Jones back in shape. That's basically what we're getting here. What's interesting about Pryor, though, is that at the end of the day, He's just an ordinary person like you or me. He's not especially strong or smart or special, and in fact, he's going through the worst time of his life. He fears that his fate to be this martyr prophet is inescapable and says, oh God, how I hate heaven, but I've got no resistance left except to run." However, Kushner does not just leave him there. Pryor resists. He refuses the role of the victim, becoming the sign of the unimaginable, the great work. The angel describes the great work as Pryor's sacrifice, but Pryor begins to undo and redefine that when he rejects her prophecy. "Free me, unfetter me, bless me or whatever, but I will be let go," he demands. Kushner shows us that even at such a low point, struck with disease and heartbreak, a person can muster up the will to reject this prescription of death and demand something better. The culmination of Pryor's character journey involves him wrestling with the angel, like in biblical story, and then ascending a ladder to heaven to ask for more life. Can we do this as well? Can we, like Pryor and like the AIDS activists that came before us, demand more life or access to a better quality of life? The final message that Kushner leaves his audience with is one of hope. Pryor successfully claims his blessing from heaven and survives his diagnosis. The millennium is still coming, but Pryor says to the angel, "You haven't seen what's to come. You've only seen what you're afraid is coming. Until it arrives, please don't be offended, but all you can see is the fear." The millennium does not have to be doomsday, but rather, according to Savrin, quote, "The greatest promise of the millennium is the possibility of life freed from the shackles of hatred, oppression, and disease." In Pryor's final monologue, he extends this alternative version of the millennium out to the audience. "This disease," he says, "will be the end of many of us, but not nearly all, and the dead will be commemorated and will struggle on with the living, and we are not going away, and I bless you. More life. The great work begins." The great work is not to lie down and die like the angel prescribed, but to live. As a message about AIDS, it is incandescently hopeful. As we are perhaps on the way to being finished with COVID, again, maybe it's not so simple, but we've gone through a lot of it already. The message feels the same. It is not easy, and notably Kushner doesn't lay out a plan for how exactly we're going to achieve this great work, this better life. But the point, it seems, is that humanity must continue to change and progress, and that a love for humanity and for life itself, as saccharine as it might seem, is the only real way to begin to heal. In the end, perhaps Kushner's ultimate conclusion about being able to move on from this great national trauma, choosing forgiveness, sympathy, and love for humanity, are not that original. I mean, it's not anything you haven't heard before. But in a way, Pryor's declaration of "I want to be alive" is radical in its simplicity. I mean, who has the energy for such guileless optimism anymore? Who has the stomach for hope? Kushner is demanding a kind of belief from us, which is why religion, from Mormonism to Judaism to wild, overbearing angels of new prophecy, are so central to the work. To unburden ourselves and start to move on, we must be willing to pray Kaddish over our enemies, to welcome home the prodigal son, and to reject the angel that demands we lie down and submit. It is a bitter pill to swallow for a nation that is very sick. However, we cannot stop moving. Even in the face of thousands of deaths during COVID, there have been small pinpoints of light that seem to fulfill Pryor's hope. The establishment of mutual aid funds, drive-by birthday well-wishes, and the countless people working very hard to push the vaccine out to the masses. Perhaps these are the things that Kushner believes will continue to propel humanity forward, and maybe as well they can begin to give us some modicum of peace. Thank you so much for listening.